Good afternoon, everybody. Today we will be exploring Russian history in the second half of the 19th century, in particular the process known as Russification, which occurred in the Russian Empire. This process involved the attempts of the Russian state and Russian authorities to turn the various subject people into the empire, such as Poles, Kazakhs, and Georgians, into Russians and subsume their cultures into Russian culture. To call the Russian Empire in 1900 massive would be an understatement. It covered 9 million square miles and had a population of roughly 125 million inhabitants, 7% of the world's total. Only the British Empire, with its territories in Canada and Australia, and its control of India, could match the Russian Empire for size and outmatch it in population. Unlike the British Empire, however, the Russian Empire was, at least in theory, highly centralized, with all power stemming from the Tsar in St. Petersburg, and no alternative power centers such as Sydney or Ottawa existing. Control was maintained by the enormous Russian army and the equally impressive imperial bureaucracy, although both forces could not exert control over every corner of the empire. The strengthening of the Russian language and Russian national identity was seen by the end of the 19th century as an important way to increase imperial control. Russia's most troublesome province, at least until the 1860s, was Poland. The Poles, understandably, had never taken to having their independence stripped from them in both 1795 and 1814. Between 1815 and 1823, annexed Russian Poland was run along liberal lines and was able to retain its Senate or Sejm. But having a liberal kingdom as part of an autocratic empire was never going to work out. In 1823, Russian authorities attacked the largest university of the empire in Vilnius, then known by the Polish name of Wilno. Students, mostly Poles, were accused of sedition and either jailed or exiled. The powers of the Sejm were curtailed, and the Russian forces in Poland were placed under the command of the brutal and neurotic Grand Duke Constantine, brother of the Tsar. Constantine had no intention of respecting the Polish constitution. He abolished Polish social and patriotic organizations and replaced Poles with Russians in important administrative positions. Secret societies, especially popular with Polish military officers, called for an uprising to throw off Tsarist rule. In November 1830, young Polish officers in the Warsaw Military Academy revolted in what soon became a nationalist uprising. On the 25th of January 1831, the Sejm passed the Act of Dethronization on Nicholas I, which ended the Polish-Russian personal union and was effectively a declaration of war on Russia. A Russian army then invaded, but was turned away from Warsaw by a number of bloody and costly Polish victories. The Poles then waited for foreign aid, but none came. Although the Polish cause was popular with public opinion throughout Europe and North America, governments did not wish to anger the Russians by helping the Poles. The British, in particular, were reluctant to help a country that was the traditional ally of France. Slowly, the Russians crushed the Poles until in September 1831 Warsaw fell. The Polish army then slipped into Prussia and surrendered there rather than surrendering to the Russians. Reprisals in Russian Poland were immediate and severe. Confiscation of property, arrests, and deportations were common. The kingdom's constitution was suspended, which meant the end of a separate Polish Sejm and army. The University of Warsaw was closed, as was the University of Wilno. Cultural Russification in the empire's former Polish provinces involved the liquidation of the Uniate or Greek Catholic Church in 1838-9 and the abolition of the Lithuanian Code of Laws. Émigrés left in numbers, mostly to France, and were hailed as champions of liberty as they passed through the German states. These émigrés encouraged conspiracies back in Poland from the safety of their new countries. Russian Poland was, however, quiet in 1848, a year in which uprisings broke out in both the Prussian and Austrian sections of the former country. Following the end of the Crimean War, the new Russian Tsar, Alexander II, embarked on an extensive series of liberalizing reforms, most famously the abolition of serfdom throughout the empire in 1861. In Poland, Alexander offered consolatory measures in cultural and religious matters, and the creation of an agricultural society to help solve questions to do with farming and the peasantry. Simultaneously, however, the Tsar warned the Poles against political daydreaming. Out of the agricultural society grew a group of well-to-do political reformers known as the Whites, whilst at the same time students, younger army officers, artisans, and members of the lower gentry, known as the Reds, put pressure on the agricultural society to offer fiercer opposition. In Warsaw, rebellious crowds clashed with Russian troops, resulting in a number of deaths. The Russians turned to a Pole, Alexander Wielopolski, to take control of the situation. The Russians granted Wielopolski's demands for the return of the Polish language in education, the restoration of local government, and the emancipation of the Jewish people in Poland in return for him ending the disturbances. Wielopolski's contempt for public opinion, however, and his high-handed methods, especially the disbanding of the agricultural society and a showdown with the Catholic Church, estranged him from the Poles. Tensions grew after another massacre of demonstrators in Warsaw occurred. In January 1863, the Reds' secret organization, the National Committee, called on the peoples of Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine to rise up, announced peasant emancipation, and appealed for support from Jewish Poles. The uprising did not control any fixed towns, instead waging a guerrilla war from the forests of Poland, Lithuania, and today's Belarus. Once more, no outside help was forthcoming, and the Prussians actually joined the Russians in support, and the uprising was crushed in 1864. The following decades saw a complete Russification of Russian Poland, now known only as Vistula land, as a punishment. A massive Russian garrison, Cyrillic street signs, and a large new Orthodox church in Warsaw were status symbols of the Poles' defeat. Even as the Polish economy eventually made Vistula land the richest province in the empire, the Polish question remained off the agenda of the European powers until 1914. Russification also occurred in Lithuania and Belarus, which had previously been important parts of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In these lands, as in Poland, Cyrillic letters were brought in to replace the Latin script previously used. Lithuania's Governor-General, Mikhail Muravyov, prohibited the public use of spoken Polish and Lithuanian, and closed Polish and Lithuanian schools. Teachers from other parts of Russia who did not speak these languages were now moved in to teach pupils Russian. What the Russian bayonet didn't accomplish, the Russian school will, said Muravyov. Lithuanians and Poles were banned from holding any public jobs, including as either teachers or doctors, in Lithuania. This forced educated Lithuanians to move to other parts of the Russian Empire to find work. The old legal code in the area was dismantled, and a new one, based on the Russian code and written in the Russian language with Russian script, was enacted. Russian became the only administrative and judicial language in the area. In Ukraine, known during the times of the empire as the Ukraine, signs of Ukrainian national identity were suppressed. all publications written in Ukrainian, with the exception of historical documents, were now banned. There has never been, is not, and cannot be any separate Little Russian language, wrote Russian Minister of Internal Affairs Pyotr Valuyev in 1863, with Little Russian being the offensive term for Ukrainians given to them by Russian nationalists. Ukrainian culture flourished only in the Habsburg lands, where historians and writers led the way in rediscovering Ukrainian myths and occasionally formulating some new ones. The importation of Ukrainian language texts into the Russian Empire was, however, banned. In the Crimean Peninsula, many of the traditional Muslim population, the Tatars, were forcibly expelled to the Ottoman Empire following the Crimean War for the support that they had shown towards the British and the French. Altogether, at least 800,000 Crimean Tatars left the peninsula during the course of the 19th century. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated by members of the revolutionary organization the People's Will. His successor, Alexander III, adopted a much stricter policy towards the Russian Empire's various nationalities. For Alexander III, expressions of national identity were evidence of disloyalty towards the Russian state and himself as Tsar. Alexander III's ascension coincided with an upsurge in Russian chauvinism in the empire, fitting well with a period of general ultra-nationalism in Europe. Increasingly, this Russian nationalism venerated the humble spirit and hardships faced by the Russian peasant, and considered that the struggles of the Russian people to survive in their harsh geographic situation had made their culture superior to the other European cultures, supposedly defined by their avarice and their decadence. The Germans of the Baltic provinces, who had long been loyal to the Russian Empire and provided some of its finest statesmen, were deprived of their German language university, and their ancient secondary schools were now Russified. The Latvians and Estonians in the Baltic did not object to the action by the government against the Germans, who they had reason to dislike as their ancient feudal overlords and landowners, but the prospect of the German language being replaced by the Russian language held little attraction, and Estonians and Latvians strongly resented the pressure to abandon their Lutheran faith for an Orthodox one. The attempt to abolish many aspects of Finnish autonomy united the Finns in opposition to St. Petersburg in the 1890s. In 1904, the son of a Finnish senator assassinated the Russian governor, and passive resistance to Russian policies became almost universal, in a time referred to in Finland today as the Years of Oppression. In the Caucasus Mountains to the south, effective and widespread passive resistance also occurred among the traditionally Russophile Armenians when the Russian authorities began to interfere with the organization of the Armenian Church and to close the schools maintained from its funds. Armenians were subject to many of the hurtful stereotypes of the Jews, such as accusations that they held an economic monopoly over the other peoples of the Caucasus Mountains. In Georgia, study of the Georgian language was discouraged, and the very name Georgia was banned from newspapers. Strikes and peasant uprisings here became increasingly common. In today's Azerbaijan, the discovery of oil in Baku saw the city grow faster than New York or London in the second half of the 19th century, as settlers and adventurers flocked to the city from all over the Russian Empire. Soon, half of all of the oil sold in international markets was being extracted in Baku. Interestingly, Russification policies were not pursued with much vigor in the Muslim lands of Central Asia. Here, Russian rule was far more reflective of British and French rule in their colonies, which required cooperation with local elites and life for ordinary people continuing much as it had done before. Still, the area was subject to mass Russian colonization efforts as thousands of Russian farmers flocked into today's Kazakhstan to seek new land. The building of new railroads served a vital function in the increasing presence of Russians on the steppe. Eventually, Russian interference in local affairs grew, so resented that a pan-Turkic movement, calling for a unification with the Turks of Anatolia, began to gain traction, at least among intellectuals. The position of Jewish people in the Russian Empire was the worst of all. As a result of their history and religious traditions, as well as of centuries of social and economic discrimination, the Jews were overwhelmingly concentrated in commercial and intellectual professions. They were prominent both as businessmen and as political radicals, hateful to the bureaucrats as socialists, and to the lower classes as capitalists. The pogroms, or anti-Jewish riots, which broke out in various localities in the months after the assassination of Alexander II in 1881, effectively ended any dreams for assimilation on Western European pattern for Russia's Jewish community. Local imperial officials performed poorly in their duties in protecting Jewish lives and properties, and at worst worked with the anti-Semitic rioters. The most important result of the 1881 pogrom wave was the promulgation in May 1882 by the new Tsar of the notorious Temporary Rules, which banned Jewish people from buying farmland, getting mortgages, or even working on Sundays. Despite their name, these rules remained in effect to the very end of the Russian Empire. By the turn of the 20th century, the terms Jews and revolutionaries had come to be synonymous for some state officials. Russian nationalism reached its most severe with the formation and actions of the so-called Black Hundreds, formed during and after the 1905 revolution described in your textbook. The Black Hundreds were composed primarily of landowners, rich peasants, bureaucrats, merchants, police, and clergy, who supported the principles of orthodoxy, autocracy, and Russian nationalism. Particularly active from 1906 to 1914, they conducted raids with the unofficial approval of the government against various revolutionary groups and pogroms against Jewish people. The 1905 Odessa pogrom in the southwest of the empire saw hundreds of Jewish people murdered in the streets and thousands more lose their homes. Jewish emigration to the US and to settler colonies in Palestine increased, leading us neatly into our next lecture on Zionism.